Good evening. Good evening. Welcome to the Northshire Bookstore's third annual Christmas bookseller presentation. As many of you know, our booksellers are a little different from the ones you see in the big box stores or around. They're not clerks, they're actually booksellers, and they read what they are selling, and they're very knowledgeable. We're used to, in the Northshire, I often equate our booksellers or make an analogy to our booksellers being like doctors. They prescribe things to people. If you're down, we can take care of that.
That's what I did last night. I ran in here and I said I'm desperate.
Yeah. So, but one of the drawbacks is that over the holidays there isn't always the time for us to get out from behind the registers and help you all and give you personal attention as we normally like to do. So it's through that we came up with the idea of this bookseller presentation every Christmas, just to give you a little as much help as we can in helping you find books for whomever you're searching for. The books tonight will all be, anything that's presented tonight by our booksellers will be 20% off just for tonight. And please help yourself to cookies and mulled cider over on the side there. We're going to start off the night with Sarah Knight, who has been here many years, since books were on stone tablets, I think. Sarah usually, excuse me, I'm sorry. Sarah normally haunts the mystery section. She's got a few different recommendations tonight. Please welcome Sarah Knight.
Thank you. I didn't know I was haunting the mystery section, but I've been described as other ways, so I guess that one's okay. I'm going to talk about a few mysteries that are really good for holiday giving, and then a couple other things just for fun. The first book that I'm recommending is John Grisham's new mystery, The Racketeer. This is a really fun read. It's about, and this is to quote John Grisham, okay, a federal judge is murdered, and our hero in prison knows who did it and why. And after our hero gets himself out of prison and is going on, the reader realizes that our hero, who is narrating the story, is really not a very reliable character, because things keep shifting. Things that he says and tells people aren't really true. It's a great story. There's good pacing. There's interesting characters. And I couldn't put it down. I just couldn't put it down. And I couldn't wait to see what happened next and what this con artist was going to do. It's a really fun read. Okay. My next book, next mystery, is a new mystery series, Talking to the Dead, by Harry Bingham. A young woman and her daughter are found murdered in a derelict apartment in Cardiff, Wales. It's a drug overdose, and a credit card of a dead millionaire is found in this squat. The detective assigned to the case is a young woman who is at the bottom of the heap. First of all, she's a woman. She has a very low rank, and she's very young. And they're kind of like throwing this at her just to get rid of it because it's a drug overdose, and she thinks it's a murder. And so she's determined at any cost to find out who did it. She ruffles a lot of feathers of both the criminal element in Cardiff and the police. And there is a 2 years missing in her employment record. And everybody wonders what happened in those 2 years. The people who don't want her to solve the case, of course, bring this up. It's enjoyable, interesting, a good psychological character study, and I can't wait to read the next one in this series. Okay, next one. The next one is The Double Game by Dan Fesperman. A middle-aged PR man receives an anonymous note about an article he wrote 20 years ago which ruined another novelist's career. The note says he should dig into this incident again and find out what really happened. It's a spy thriller, it's espionage, and as he sets off to investigate the story, he's told different things by different people, and it weaves in and out of intrigue, double, triple agents, and that kind of thing. And what makes this book really different is that other older espionage novels are mentioned throughout the novel as this man, middle-aged man, goes through these different places in Europe. He mentions novels that were set there. Erik Ambler, John le Carré, all the really great espionage authors are mentioned in this. It's very fun, and as a mystery, I at first found all this espionage additions to be a little bit annoying. But then I got really interested in them, and then I realized at the end he has like a 6-page appendix listing mystery writers and what they wrote from like 1890 to about 1970. And it's really a good bibliography. This book is really, if you have a friend who is a serious mystery reader, this would be the book for them. If you have a friend who isn't a serious mystery reader, if you get the book for him, by the time he finishes, he'll have like 200 other books that are listed at the back, and he can become a serious mystery reader. So I highly recommend this book. Another mystery is Archer Mayer. He has a novel every year. It's usually set in Brattleboro, but this time Joe Gunther of the Vermont Bureau of Investigation is back, and they're trying to solve a mystery in Northampton, Massachusetts. An old lady in Beacon Hill in Boston surprises 3 B&E guys, and one of them hits her, and she ends up dying. And then Joe Gunther investigates a breaking and entering at Tucker Peak outside of Brattleboro, and he hears that all the jewelry that was stolen goes through Northampton now, that's where it's fenced. And since the old lady had a granddaughter who was to inherit all her jewelry and didn't, she hears that Northampton is the spot to be, so she goes to Northampton, and of course the police get really annoyed with her because she goes around and investigates and gets herself in all kinds of trouble and gets abducted, and they have to save her. But this is a very entertaining, very fun, and Archer Mayer is always a fun read and an easy recommend for people who like mysteries. Okay. Now for a fun book. This is a book about Hello Kitty. Hello Kitty became a famous icon in the mid-1970s. And she has no mouth. She has a red bow that she always wears in her left ear. And she's kind of the Japanese portrayed her, and she became the queen of cute. If you wanted something that's cute and too cute and kawaii, as the Japanese call it, it's Hello Kitty. She has lasted all these years. She's still big in Japan, and if you go up to the children's department, you'll see all kinds of things. She's become a worldwide icon. And this book is based on not one, but 3 exhibitions of artwork by famous artists around the world who were asked to interpret Hello Kitty, how she had influenced them, what they thought of her. One of the exhibits was in Los Angeles. It was so popular they had a second, well, it was more of an event, and they had it at Barker Hangar. They had a Ferris wheel with Hello Kitty, and they really made it into a kind of a song and dance exhibit. And then they had she was represented in a gallery in Miami, and these are other well-known artists' interpretations of Hello Kitty. There's a Hello Kitty chandelier. There's Hello Kitty. There's Hello Kitty Hello Kitty by a famous ceramic artist. She's everywhere. She's everywhere, and she's not just for kids. And then the best of all the Hello Kitty tattoos you can go out and get. This is a really fun book, and I have to say that I do have quite a few little Hello Kitties at home that I've gotten over the years. And then, if you think that book is silly, this book is even sillier. This is Moby Dick in 12 words with needle-felted characters. This is a series of books called My Cozy Classics. And there's a Pride and Prejudice and several other well-known classics. But Moby Dick is my favorite. I think this would be a great stocking stuffer. If you are friends with an English teacher, with people who are English majors, and there are a lot of them in my age group, or just people that have a bizarre sense of humor, or need a gift, I would get this for them. It's really adorable. You know, the captain, a leg, peg leg, sail. So, in 12 words or less, you know the whole story. But it really is for people who actually have read the book or know the story really well. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay. Being the MC, I don't always get to recommend books, but I am going to do it. I'm going to recommend one anyway. A few months ago, I reconnected via Facebook, as everyone does, with an old high school buddy, a guy I used to play guitar with. And in the process of getting to know each other, I found out he had just written a book. He was the guitarist I always wanted to be. He's the type of man who, he's not a performer, he's a musician. He never performs anywhere, and he's the best guitarist I know, period. He published a book, which he actually self-published, called First Learn to Practice. It's by Tom Haney, and it just covers how to practice. It doesn't mention any kind of instrument or anything like that. It's how you get your mind set on practicing your instrument. I read it. It's actually really good, even though it's written by a friend of mine. And I highly recommend it for any musicians. If you're buying for a musician this year, this is the book to get. Next up is Stan Hynds. Stan has been the buyer here for 12 and a half years. He buys all the adult books on the sales floor here. He's the adult book buyer. So he knows every book in the store, so his recommendations count. Stan?
I don't know every book in this store, although people sometimes ask me, have you read all those books? No, not even a small percentage of them. All right, who's read this? A couple of you. Yeah, I know. I shouldn't be talking about an old book, but this was my favorite book that I read. My favorite novel that I read this year. Rules of Civility came out in hardcover last year. It came out in paperback this summer. It's the most fun I've had reading fiction all year. It takes place in the course of a year, 1938 in New York. It's about a young woman, Katie Content is her name, from one of the outer boroughs. She goes to Manhattan to make her way, and she's working in something like a steno pool, basically, and has a good friend named Eve, and they happen into a jazz club one night and meet a dapper young fellow named Tinker Gray, whose brother hasn't shown up to meet him, and off they go on these adventures. And it is just the most atmospheric, wonderfully written, descriptive books you could possibly read. And so if you want to give somebody a paperback that they're going to love, give them Rules of Civility. There's a passage in here where and it's written by Amor Towles, who came here, and he is a man. And a lot of people have commented, how did a man write so well about women? And he just says, well, he's a storyteller. A good story is a good story. And he's an investment banker. Yeah, we had a wonderful time with the author here. But there's a passage where he describes a bartender pouring a martini. That is, if there's a better description of a martini being poured in fiction, I haven't read it. Boy, it made me thirsty. This is a fantastic book. All right, Katie Content goes to work at some point in this book at a fancy New York magazine. It's not the New Yorker, but it might be a rival to the New Yorker, and that takes me to my next book, which is the Big New Yorker Book of Dogs. I think this is one of the best gift books of the season, and it's perfect for a lot of our customers, people who read the New Yorker, people who like dogs. There's a lot of overlap there, this, I don't really have to tell you about this book because it is exactly what it is. It's the New Yorker, and it's things about dogs. There's fiction, essays, there's photographs, covers from the New Yorker, and of course cartoons. And the paper is bright and white, and the type is nice and big. It's a fantastic gift book. It's got a foreword by Malcolm Gladwell. Of course, there's a lot of James Thurber in here. So this will be perfect for a lot of people on your list. Dog people, take notice. I like to talk about cookbooks when I do this. We do a lot of cooking in my family. I love to cook. My wife and I love to cook together, but we don't do a lot of baking, and that's why. So I'm going to talk about a couple of baking books because I don't know anything about it. Come on. All right. If I were a baker and we're planning to be one, I think I might choose this book to bake from, The Bouchon Bakery by Thomas Keller. He had a big cookbook a couple years ago called Ad Hoc, which was the hot cookbook of the season. It went out of stock. I'm not saying this is going to, but take note. It's just beautiful. I think it's the prettiest cookbook of the season. There's some nice spreads. Here's some shortbread for you and some macarons.
The bakery is in Napa.
Yeah.
And there's a Bouchon cafe,
Right.
and the bakery is right next
Very
to it.
famous restaurant and bakery. There's some tarts for you.
Yeah.
I was here. Here's a nice section about something called, and I can't read it. Fleurer. There's a particular way you're supposed to throw flour on the counter. You know, if you're like rolling out, and I've been doing it wrong all this time, but you learn it right in here. Anyway, it's really beautiful book. And another baking book. Who's got this book at home? King Arthur Fleury, at least one. Okay, this is exactly the same book. The content is exactly the same. So why am I talking about this book? Because this is kind of like a paperback, but it's not a paperback. This is like Tyvek or Kevlar or something. I don't know what it is, but it's a revolutionary binding, and look what it does. This is called lay flat. So if you have a paperback cookbook at home and you're trying to keep it open, you can't. This book you can. So if you're thinking about giving the classic King Arthur Flower Baker's Companion, think about giving the paperback that's not really a paperback. All right. It's the 75th birthday of the Appalachian Trail this year. And that's kind of special to us because one of our own Northshire's finest, Sarah Tennyson, actually walked the Appalachian Trail. I don't know when she did it, but she did it barefoot, walking backwards. And she's not here to dispute that. She didn't really. But anyway, if you have friends who have done the trail, thought about doing the trail, like to walk little parts of the trail, this is a great gift book. The Appalachian Trail, Celebrating America's Hiking Trail. It's by the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, and it's got a foreword by Bill Bryson. Just lots of great pictures. There are chapters on shelters and footbridges and towers and flora and fauna and so forth. And there's chapters on each section of the trail. Very nice book. I did want to point out one of my favorite parts of the trail to know about, although I've never been there, is in North Carolina, the Roan Highlands, and there are these beautiful balds down there. It looks like Scotland, or what I imagine Scotland looks like, anyway, because I haven't been there either. But they're really lovely pictures. So that's a good gift book, which takes me to, I've got a lot of segues going tonight. My favorite nonfiction book that I read this year, Stand Up That Mountain by Jay Lucy. This is a book also about the Appalachian Trail, and it also happens to take place in North Carolina. Jay Lutzy is a native Tar Heel, and he was living at his family's cabin down in that very region near the Roan Highlands in western North Carolina, kind of as almost as a hermit and writing fiction. And then this story basically happened to him in 1999. He got a call from some people who lived nearby in a little community called Dogtown, and they said, Paul's going to tear that mountain down. And he kind of thought, who is this and who is Paul? Well, Paul Brown owned a gravel company, and he had a stone crusher that he had brought into this mountain, and he was going to crush gravel, and it was going to have a little impact on some of the neighbors. And that began a years-long battle of Jay and his neighbors and some lawyers and a lot of other people to try to save this beautiful region, which was, importantly, right next to and inside of the Appalachian Trail, or at least this particular segment of the Appalachian Trail. And it's a great book about current issues. It's a great piece of nature writing. I think if anybody has interest in land use, the trail itself, or natural history, this is a really, it's a page turner. There are a lot of agencies, there are a lot of lawyers, there are a lot of conservancies, and I got a little mixed up every now and then about who was who, but it really didn't matter. It is such a very good read, and it's so well written. I highly recommend that. And those are the books that I have to recommend to you today.
As you might guess, hiring at the Northshire Bookstore is a little difficult. A few months ago, we were looking for a children's bookseller, and the search went on and on and on. Children's bookselling is a very different kind of bookselling than what we do down here. For one thing, when you're selling young adult books, you have to know just how much drugs, sex, and violence is in every book that you sell, because you can get in trouble if you don't. But just the knowledge of children's books, to have that going, as well as having the personality to be able to sell on the sales floor, it's a difficult combination to find. 4 months ago, we found it. Aubrey Restifo joined us 4 months ago. It's like she's been here for years. You will be so very lucky if you wind up in the children's bookstore, in the children's section of the bookstore, and you run into Aubrey and she helps you, because she's just terrific. Aubrey, now that I've embarrassed you totally.
Wow. Hope I don't. Okay. So as Erik said, I'm relatively new here, but I have selected a variety of children's books, some picture books, and then for the older readers as well, with attention, of course, to the age group that each is appropriate for. I'm really short, so you'll find out. Okay, so I want to start with One Frozen Lake. And One Frozen Lake is one of the first books I read for the holiday, and I wrote about it in the Holiday Independent this year. And it's a book that's appropriate for ages 3 to 8, but like all picture books that are wonderful, it's appropriate for any age. And this story is great for kids and families who are interested in reading about families, family activities, and then intergenerational relationships. So the story is first and foremost about ice fishing, but it's never really about catching the fish. A grandparent and a grandchild go ice fishing, and we get to see what's going on below the surface of the ice, but really the story is about building the ice town above, drinking hot chocolate, playing Go Fish, whatever you would do with your grandparent while you're failing at catching fish, really. So it's a book about constructing memories with your family. And, you know, in very few words, this book achieves really capturing the strong ties between grandparents and their grandchildren. So again, this is an appropriate gift for a grandparent to a grandchild, but it's also great for perhaps maybe building a relationship between grandparent and grandchild, or to encourage activities such as ice fishing for someone who might be a little hesitant. So that's One Frozen Lake by Deborah Jo Larson. My next also hits upon every age group, but it's very different. It's Red Knit Cap Girl by Naoko Stoop. This book also I would recommend for ages 3 to 9. Again, it's appropriate for everyone. Like One Frozen Lake, it uses very few words, but this book is more in the tradition of Japanese folktales. It's got a very big message, and it's very simple, it's very serene, and it's also very whimsical. But again, it's a big idea. There is a young girl with giant boots, and she's super cute, and she wants to meet the moon. She lives in an enchanted forest, and she corrals her woodland creatures to develop strategies to become friends with the moon. She fails a lot at first, but eventually she realizes that the way in which you become attached to the moon or get to meet who you really want to or understand the other is through, I suppose, investigating. There was a great way to put this earlier, but she really has to come to understand the essence of the moon. She has to be silent with the moon. She has to sort of lift light up to the moon. So she can't just, give her favorite things to the moon, and the creatures can't just be themselves or give the things they like to the moon, but they have to find this middle ground. And I must admit, I am a student of linguistics, and this interests me in a variety of ways involving the construction of meaning. But this book absolutely achieves everything that the New York Times says it does. It's one of the best illustrated books of the year. You can just see how gorgeous this is. Super cute, lots of critters, owl. Yeah, this is a favorite. Next children's book is More by I.C. Springman. And More is a book of few words. So again, ages 3 to 8, also fine for everyone. I think of this book as being a book for Vermonters, mostly because it's about learning the meaning of enough and living simply. And we follow a magpie who collects a lot of little things. So this is appropriate for perhaps a child who likes to collect all the marbles and the threads. And the magpie goes around and is collecting all these little things, the wall cassette tape, a pawn, and then, of course, the nest, it breaks. So they learn what it means to have enough, what it means to be grateful. And so it encourages that sort of mentality of sustainability and reducing in your life. So it's appropriate to sort of foster that with your children if that's what you're interested in doing, which most likely you are. And again, very few words in this. The pictures absolutely carry it. Children can just look at the pictures and enjoy seeing all the objects. Kind of like when you read a Where's Waldo book and you're not really advanced enough to actually find Waldo, but you enjoy it anyway. So, there you go. I mean, that was always my experience. Okay, so on that note, I have some books for older readers as well. Let me just find them. All right, so we'll start with Sun. Sun is the final book in the Giver Quartet by Lois Lowry. And Sun is appropriate for ages 10 and up, but really it can be enjoyed by anybody who's read The Giver, adults who have read The Giver and wanted to know what happened to baby Gabe, teenagers. The book is philosophically dense enough to interest more sophisticated readers, and it's dystopian enough to get those hesitant readers into it too. But again, having read The Giver really helps, but you don't need to read the other 2 books in the series in order to understand it. So it follows 3 intertwined stories. That of 14-year-old Claire, who we learn is baby Gabe's birth mother. And we follow her story as she looks for her son, and ultimately sacrifices her youth in order to look over him. We have Jonas, who we also follow, who has to confront evil, and we also follow Gabriel, who grows into a young teenager and spends all of his time building a boat in order to reunite with his mother. So there's a lot of love, heartbreak, obstacles, magic. It's really everything that you could want to hit all of those areas. And the book always moves. So you don't have to worry about, boring your hesitant 12-year-old if you're using this as a gateway. So that's Sun. The next book I'm going to talk about is my favorite book this year in terms of young adult. And I don't normally truly enjoy all young adult novels. But the ones that I do really appreciate are the ones that are good for all kids of any gender, of both the hesitant kids and the into reading sorts of kids. And that's Where Things Come Back by John Corey Whaley. And this is his debut. And it's just come out in paperback, which is handy. I would suggest this book for older teens, 14 plus, mostly because it's sophisticated. There's not a lot of sex, not a lot of violence. There's no drug use or anything like that. So in that sense, it's a safe book. But really what it is, it's tragic and it's understated, something that might not be realized or appreciated fully by someone much younger than 14. So Whaley's story follows two brothers and two teens and a missionary as they struggle to come into age. They're graduating high school, and they live in a very boring town. But suddenly the town becomes absurd because there's the reappearance of an extinct bird, or believed to be extinct bird, called the Lazarus. And they sort of make this big spectacle out of it. The town becomes obsessive and famous, and around that same time, not Gabriel, that's the brother's name, the main character's brother, who everyone in town adores, he's 15, disappears. And the best thing about that, even though it's very sad, is that we develop a relationship with all the characters by the time this happens. So it's not just a book about possible kidnapping. It's not just a book about faith. It's not a book about love. It's not just coming of age. More than anything else, it's, I suppose, it's just a book about being a teenager. So, again, I would compare it to Perks of Being a Wallflower, and I think it's one that'll be reread over and over again. And yeah, can't say enough about it, really. Probably could say more, actually. Okay. Finally. Notes. I have The Last Dragon Slayer by Jasper Fforde. This is another young adult novel that's appropriate for any young adult reader. Again, 14 plus would be good for this one. Also a very safe book, but I only recommend slightly older because it's so cynical and so witty that perhaps you wouldn't fully appreciate all the jokes if you were too young. So this is Jasper Fforde's first novel for young adults, and it totally shows. It's sophisticated, it's witty, it's totally jaded, and like anyone can talk about this book. It's that enjoyable. It's a logical follow-up for teens who read Harry Potter when they were younger and are now over it because they've realized that Harry Potter doesn't really happen. It's not critical of magic, but it's definitely talks about how something such as Harry Potter can become institutionalized and then dull and then go out of style. So in Dragon Slayer, like I said, magic has become mainstream. But it's out of style, no one cares anymore, there are a few remaining magicians in the world. And then around the same time that everything's going bankrupt, the department head also disappears, leaving the only non-magical person, who happens to be a 15-year-old girl, to take care of all the crazy magicians and all of the, slobbery beasts. And she has to basically keep everyone in line and follow all the policies, when really she should be spending time being a teenager. But of course, something exciting happens to the non-magical girl. Something comes up with a dragon dying. And when a dragon dies, the land becomes available to anyone who can really claim it. and she ends up being in charge of managing that land. And although it sounds totally bland, it brings magic into her life, it revives the community, and it's still totally hilarious. So this is great for your kids who don't hate magic, but maybe liked it once. People who might be a little passive about it. It's great for kids who are starting to feel nostalgia for when they were 12. And it's a good avenue. It's a really good avenue for clever fiction that isn't stuck in the tired trends right now. It's a departure from the Hunger Games. I love the Hunger Games, but it's something different. It's less dystopian. It's less magical. It's something totally new. And with that, that's all I have to offer. And please, buy them. You're welcome.
You were great.
Thank you.
Lightning doesn't always strike twice, but in our children's department it does. We've anybody who's been up there knows our children's booksellers are just the best around. Martha Cornwell's one of them. Martha actually works both upstairs and down. She's wonderful. She can sell you something from the fiction section just as well as she can sell you something from the children's department. She's going to talk about some more children's books. Martha Cornwell.
Lovely. Well, as I said, I get to work in one of the most magical places upstairs, and I have some fun books for you today. The first one I want to talk about is Olivia and the Fairy Princess. One of my favorite children's characters. She's back this time in the throes of a midlife crisis at the tender age of, I want to say, 3-ish. And she realizes that there are really too many pretty pink princesses in the world. And she wants to be something different. She wants to be unique. And what is she going to be? And it's full of ideas for her. She's an astronaut. She might be a warthog. She might be a reporter. Beautiful illustrations in black and white with that little hint of color. And just a really empowering message for little girls to dream big, be unique. One of my favorites this year for kind of the toddler age group, but definitely ages 3 up to probably 7 or 8, but really for all of us who, you know, at one time dreamed of being princesses and then realized I can be so much more. So moving on from there, another fantastic book that we sell in our toddler section, but really is for everybody who loves Beatrix Potter. This is the further tale of Peter Rabbit. It's written by Emma Thompson. For those of us who have been waiting for the further adventures for like 60 years, here it is. Peter is basking in Mr. McGregor's garden. He's swept away in a picnic basket and ends up in Scotland. And becomes involved in the Highland Games and becoming the champion, radish-throwing champion in the tournament. Beautiful pictures again. Really talks about, you know, our mischievous rabbit. The pictures look almost exactly like Beatrix Potter's images. It's gorgeous. And it's a really beautiful gift edition. It comes with a CD of Emma Thompson reading the book. And for those of you who have listened to Sense and Sensibility and any of her movies, she has an amazing storyteller voice. Beautiful, a great gift for grandparents to give to grandchildren. Further tale of Peter Rabbit. So those are the two kind of child books that we've got. And then I'm going to move on to mid-child section, which mainly is for kids that are of 5th grade to about 8th grade or so. I'm going to start with The Extraordinary Education of Nicholas Benedict. This is a reason to fall in love with the Mysterious Benedict Society again. It's the backstory of a narcoleptic genius, founder of the society. It's part Oliver Twist, part Agatha Christie. It's got the perfect characters and plot. It's got a genius orphan who falls asleep at the most awful moments in time. A pitiful orphanage, a trio of horrifying bullies, Hidden Treasure, A Secret Friendship. It's got everything, and it's a book that kids cannot put down. This is the book for finicky readers, for kids who love rollicking good mysteries. It's my go-to book for mid-children, and it begins the series, and there are 3 more after this. Great for just everybody. I think it's going to be a new classic, kind of in the vein of Harry Potter. Yes, definitely boys or girls. It's gender neutral. It does focus on a male protagonist, but he's brilliant and really relatable in a lot of ways. So, Nicholas Benedict. And then we have a very different kind of mid-child book. It's called True Colors. It's written by our wonderful Vermont author, Natalie Kinsley Warsock. It's a story after my own heart. I was adopted and came to find a home here in Vermont. And this story follows a baby named Blue who is found in a tea kettle on a porch and set against a backdrop of a small Vermont farming community in the 1950s. It's simple, it's beautiful, it's filled with her kind of daily life, with barn chores and writing for the local column. She writes a little column about everybody's daily lives. It's very funny and filled with all sorts of vocabulary that I find very hilarious. And also finding her birth mother. And what she really finds, though, is her own history and a sense of belonging in this beautiful Vermont community. It's a really gentle page-turner. A beautiful story filled with a lot of Vermont folklore, a lot of really great Vermont folks. You see us all around here. We're quite the characters. A great read. I guess I should speak for myself. Sorry, friends. A great read for children ages 8 to 12, I would say, would be really good. And looking for realistic historical fiction. I know that a lot of books these days are magical and written in these wonderful different worlds, but this is a very real world book, and one after my own heart. And the last book I have is Cruel by Jennifer Albin. If you have folks on your list who like the Hunger Games, Cruel is going to be the next dystopian novel series that you want to get your kids into. It's one of the most inventive and thrilling books I've read this year. It takes place in Aras, which is a world above our world, which has been destroyed by war and famine. And it's ruled by the Guild of 12 and maintained by spinsters. There's a lot of allegory with sewing and Cruel, and they're called spinsters. They're elite, beautiful, deadly women who manipulate the threads of time and space and determine what people will eat and what they would live, and eventually they pluck your string out and you are no longer in the dear world of Eris. And interwoven into this story is Adelise, who's a gifted spinster. She has come to this world. She's 16, but she's really powerful enough to cut through the web of lies and intrigue that surrounds this really interesting world. It's the first in the Cruel series. It just came out, so you're going to have to wait for the next one. Great for readers in the high school level, 9 to 12, but you could probably get away with younger kids who are reading at a higher level, too. Great dystopian novel. So those are it.
Thank you, Martha. Our next presenter, well, let me first tell you that I went out of order. A fact which I will not hear the end of tomorrow by our next presenter. Because my office is on this floor, I wind up working the service desk here, which puts me into close proximity to Amy Palmer, who is our newest adult floor bookseller. When Amy was a customer of ours forever and was involved with a lot of our writing groups and stuff like that. So when it turned out she was looking for a job, it was what we called a no-brainer. She was immediately put on the staff, and it's like she's been here forever. She's just terrific, and she keeps me honest. She teases me a lot. Amy?
right. Happy to be speaking in front of you tonight. And my first book that I chose actually came as a result of being asked to interview the author, Alexander McCall Smith. The book is The Uncommon Appeal of Clouds. I think I'd been here about 2 weeks, and Mary asked if I would be interested in doing the interview, and I said sure, and then was panicked for the next several months. But he's a wonderful person. I loved this book. It's wonderful to have on your bedside table. It's something you can read if you've just gotten through a very heavy novel, and it's full of wonderful characters. This is the 9th addition to the Isabel Dalhousie series, which takes place in Scotland. And Isabel is an insatiably curious detective, as well as the editor of the Review of Applied Ethics. She's a philosopher. She's married to Jamie, who is a bassoonist and gives music lessons. She is the mother of Charlie, who is a precociously gifted mathematical little child. There's a lot of family relationship. There's mystery. She's asked to solve the disappearance of a Nicholas Poussin painting from a wealthy Scottish landowner. There's a lot of sort of philosophical discussion. There's artistic discussion. Her favorite poet is W.A. Auden. And so you get a lot of poetry. I actually am the type of person that if I get interested in some facet of the book, I have to go and look up everything that the poet's written. So I love doing that. There's the charm of Edinburgh. There's child rearing. You can actually see an interview with Alexander McCall Smith on our Off the Shelf, which is coming up soon. Anyway, it's a great book for anybody. I liked it a lot. And the next one is completely different vein. This is How You Lose Her by Junot Diaz, and it's his third book. And follows the adventures of Junior, who was seen in Drown, a selection of short stories, and also The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. It's pounding, rhythmic prose. It's electric, it's self-deprecating humor, it's exciting and idiomatic. Series of stories centering on Junior, and it's really about relationships with his family. He's completely unfaithful to all of his girlfriends. He's a bad, brilliant boy, and he's just a lot of fun. There's no entitlement. He's very honest about himself and how he treats women, and it's endearing, but it's more than that. It's metaphorical. It's really rich with life, and I think what got me about this is the language. He's been quoted as writing Spanglish, but it's much more than that. It's much richer, and it's angry, it's brilliant prose. I really enjoyed this. Which brings me to Pam Houston, who also was here earlier in the year, and this is a collection of short stories called Contents May Have Shifted. And the author is stuck in a dead-end relationship, and so she literally takes to the air and writes about her adventures all over the world, from, let's see, what did she do? I have to look at my notes. Riding camels in Tunisia, performing CPR on a sled dog, viewing a sky burial in Tibet, which is very graphic and lovely, surviving near crashes in airplanes, and but writing with such humor. And she calls her insight glimmers. And when she was here, she spoke a lot about that. And they're really acute observations of life. It's part spiritual quest, and she's a survivor on the move. And what I also like about this book is she has a posse of very strong female friends and massage therapists that aid her on her quest for wholeness. So this is a great book. It's very funny. Which brings me to Wicked David Sedaris, Holidays on Ice. This is kind of an old chestnut. As you probably know, he's an American humorist, comedian, author, radio personality. These are devious stories. They're, he talks about my favorite is the Sandaland Diaries, in which he is the elf Crumpet in Macy's, and he has to deal with all the retail crowds, and we get our share here, but in Macy's they're unbelievable. And then we go to season's greetings to family and friends, and I know a lot of people write letters to their friends detailing how wonderful their children are. They just got into Harvard. They're investment bankers, they're lawyers, they've just had 17 grandchildren, all of them are blonde. I mean, we all know those letters. But this is a woman's descent into madness. It's her letter to her friends, and it starts with an illegitimate Vietnamese daughter showing up, and what happens to the daughter and the family, and it's a take on those letters, so it's pretty funny, pretty wicked. And then, let's see, there's trying to explain Easter in Jesus Shaves to a group of French students in Paris. And then my personal favorite, Dinah the Christmas Whore, in which David's elder sister takes him across the tracks to rescue a woman who may or may not be abused, and brings her home to have Christmas dinner with the family. So this is, if you're dreading the holidays, this is an antidote to that. And then finally, I just loved this book. I finished it yesterday, The Roundhouse by Louise Erdrich. It just won the National Book Award. I actually cried when I finished this book because I wanted it to go on. It's just beautiful. It starts with a violent attack on a woman on a reservation in North Dakota. So you're told right away. And she is so traumatized by this event that she's stunned into silence and shock and retreats to her room and refuses to speak of what happened. Her husband is a tribal judge, and her son is Joe, and Joe is 12 years old, and just one of the most heartwarming characters that you could hope to find. He's funny. He and his group of friends decide to try and find out who the perpetrator was because his mother can't speak, and it brings them to the Roundhouse, which is a sacred space where Ojibwe ceremonies are held, and it's full of family, it's full of relationship, it's full of metaphor, it's the spirit world, grandfathers that have history of when the buffalo roamed, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful story. And I won't tell you how it ends, but it's rich with place, depth of character, vision, culture, humor. This book has it all. It's my favorite book of this season. So thank you very much.
I was trying to think how to introduce the next bookseller. Most people who come to the Northshire know Bill Lewis. Every morning before we open the store, there is a morning meeting where everyone who's working that day gets together and we talk about what's going to happen that day. At the end of the morning meeting, we usually have a book review. And one of the booksellers, they're scheduled, one of the booksellers will talk about what they're reading, just a way of kind of communicating book knowledge to the rest of the staff. I know that when it's Bill's turn, I have to start the bookseller meeting a little earlier. Not because he goes on that long, but because it's that fascinating that we're always asking him questions about the books that he wants. He can sell books to booksellers, jaded booksellers. He once sold a book, I love this, he once sold a book to a telemarketer who called him at home. That's a man who can sell a book. Bill Lewis, step right up.
The most fun I had was the only time I've ever been in the hospital as an adult. The guy next to me wandered over and said, "How do you get books like that?" And I said, "I can sell them." And he bought all 3 of the first 3 Harry Potter novels in the hospital room. That was fun. The thing that none of my coworkers have said tonight is that it is nearly impossible to narrow it down to just 5 or 6 books when you read as much as we do, and I know I'm preaching to the choir. If you read, and at the end of the year someone says, what's your favorite book this year? Impossible question to answer. And I had a great deal of difficulty, and what I thought I'd do is just mention some nonfiction, history and biography, that you may not be hearing about. It's very easy when you turn on Matt Lauer in the morning, or Fresh Air in the afternoon, or some other media outlet, and hear John Meacham going on and on about Thomas Jefferson. And it's a fine book. But there are a lot of other equally good nonfiction books, and I think I speak for everybody at the store when I say that we love to discover them and then share them with you and get your feedback. So having said that, I'm going to start with a book that you've all heard about, so I'm kind of contradicting myself. There is no one working today in the field of biography who is anything like Robert Caro. If you know the story, this is volume 4 in a multi-volume biography of Lyndon Johnson, and the books have been coming out now for more than 30 years. I thought I never wanted to read a word about Lyndon Johnson. I lived through Lyndon Johnson. Of course, I associate him with Vietnam. Pick up any one of the 4 volumes, and I almost would wager that you will not be able to stop reading, even if it's a big book. The Passage of Power covers only 5 years in Johnson's life. It starts when he realizes he will not be president in 1960. Worse for him, he is relegated to the meaningless position of vice president. His life, and this is a man who's been used to exercising extraordinary power, now seems to have no purpose. Kennedy will certainly run again in '64, and in '68 Johnson's time will have passed. Everything changes on November 22, 1963. If for no other reason than you read the 100-page section of the book where you get up in the morning with Lyndon Johnson on November 22, and stay with him minute by minute throughout that day until 1 a.m. on the 23rd, the book is worth it. There is no one who works like Robert Caro. The second book was a surprise, an utter surprise. Bernard Bailyn, if you read colonial, early Republic, American history, the Revolutionary era, is no stranger to most of you. I had no idea that he was still working, and he's 91 years old. This is not recycled earlier material. It is part of a series he began almost 40 years ago. It is fresh, it is energetic, and for people who think the 17th century in North America was simply about Pocahontas, the Pilgrims, a few witches at Salem, and then we jump ahead to the 4th of July, this is an eye-opener. It's not just about English people coming to America, and it's not just about French people. It's about Swedes and Dutch and even Finns. I can't believe that Bernard Bailyn has given us a book this excellent at the young age of 91. Anyone interested in early colonial America? The next book you may have seen on display. You may have liked its cover. It's called Snowstorm in August, written by Jefferson Morley. We tend to rush our study of the American story from the period of about Lewis and Clark, the War of 1812. We tend to rush ahead to Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War. This story takes place in 1835, smack dab in the country's new capital, still new capital, Washington, D.C. There's a very good reason why the end plates have a city map, because as you read chapter after chapter, you yourself become familiar with the neighborhoods, the streets, and the avenues. This is an extraordinary piece of history writing in that it reads like a novel. Yes, it's in Washington, D.C., and Andrew Jackson is one very important president, but he only makes cameo appearances. It's the story of a former Virginia slave who comes penniless to Washington and builds a restaurant that is popular with all the Washington high society types and, unique for its time, families, husbands, wives, and children's going to restaurants was very unusual at the time. He pioneers that. It's the story of a troubled teenage slave who lives in a fairly comfortable home. The woman who owns him is very kind to him, but nonetheless she owns him. He gets into trouble, as teenage boys will, and that precipitates a series of events that draws the man who owns the restaurant, the young teen, his hardworking, long-suffering mother, the woman who owns both of them, into a story that then brings to the forefront Francis Scott Key, the man who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. It reads like a novel, and I won't give away what happens. If you live in New England and you drive around any town that's situated along a river, a stream, you have seen those brick buildings, the factory buildings. They're usually 3 stories high, sometimes 4. They have tall windows. I come from an industrial town along a river in western Connecticut where the older fellows talked about working at the mill, my grandfather. They didn't feel embarrassed to say they worked at the mill. They were proud of it. Those buildings, starting 150 years ago, made noise, things, and money. Of course, they've long since shut down, but they're so well built that they're everywhere, so we all recognize them. They all come to life in American Phoenix by Sarah S. Kilbourne. Mary Allen, our events coordinator, said, "Would you please look at this book and give me your opinion?" I read it in 2 days. For me, industrial New England came back to life. But more than that, the story starts with a young man coming from East London. He's a Cockney who probably never saw more than 10 minutes of sunlight any day of his life up until he was 12 or 13 years old. You wonder how anyone could breathe in the impoverished East London neighborhoods where he grew up. He comes with nothing but the shirt on his back, and he only knows one person in America. This is in 1845. His story is the story of rags to riches, never give up determination. It's the story of Yankee ingenuity when New England was furnishing products globally to the world. And it's also the story of the rise of American greatness. I'd also mention that the author will be here Saturday night. And if you know your New England landscape, please come and hear her. The next book is a World War II story. Many of you may have read books by Alex Kershaw. Alex Kershaw's calling card when he writes World War II histories is to take small groups of people, even individual people, tell their stories in a compelling way, and through small focus, deliver the meaning of what that war was about. I don't have to apologize in saying that that war was truly a just war. A lot of injustice happened within the war, but the war itself was fought for good reasons. This is the story of an ordinary American who I think starts the war as a lieutenant, winds up a captain. Nothing remarkable about him except he's smart and he's tough and he's independent. His name is Felix Sparks. Felix War begins fighting in Sicily in 1943. He fights through Italy as the Allies slug their way up the boot. The war concludes for him about 500 days after it starts when he leads the first group of Americans into and opens the gates to a place called Dachau. Alex Kershaw hits you in the heart without trying to. He's never sappy, he's never contrived, he simply lets the story tell itself. Alex will be here almost fittingly on Pearl Harbor night, December 7th, and if you haven't heard him speak, you're in for a treat. Finally, we started with Lyndon Johnson, and I mentioned the word Vietnam. I don't want to read more books about Vietnam. I did it 25, 30 years ago. For me, the war suggests unpleasant things, to say the least. But I always wondered what the full story was about how America got to the point where Lyndon Johnson took us ass over tea kettle into that terrible war. And then, of course, Nixon prosecuted it further. I wondered what the story was. Embers of War by Frederick Logevall is the book I've been waiting for. Everyone I've recommended it to has gotten back to me, emailed me, called me up. One fellow keeps coming in and telling, and I trust his judgment, by the way. He said he couldn't believe this book didn't win the Pulitzer Prize this year. It is a riveting story that does not start in the 60s. It starts at the end of World War I, when a very young Ho Chi Minh tries to get an appointment with Woodrow Wilson because he's heard the great American president say that colonial people are entitled to their freedom. The book proceeds through World War II, when Indochina is still controlled by the French, but Ho Chi Minh and a host of other Vietnamese actors who you meet still don't give up on the idea of freedom. And once again, as that war comes to an end, they think an American president will help them, because Franklin Roosevelt, A, said in the Atlantic Charter that colonialism would be ended, and B, Franklin Roosevelt had no use for Charles de Gaulle and the French. That's not what happens. The French come back at the end of World War II. And slowly, dollar by dollar, decision by decision, America starts to become involved. When the French finally, half the book, by the way, is the story of the French tragedy in Indochina. In 1954, Dien Bien Phu, and then here come the Americans. And finally in the 60s, it's open war. A book we've been waiting for. It's riveting, it's clearly written, and it has lessons. That's all I have to say, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Lewis. The one thing we haven't spoken about tonight, and I'm not going to go into great detail, is the things that aren't books in the store. There's quite a few gifts. We have clothing. We have the best stocking stuffers around. My favorite right now, and I'm sure everyone knows, someone who needs an Edgar Allan Poe lunchbox. On that, I think we'll close. Please know that you'll get 20% on anything that's been mentioned here tonight, including the Edgar Allan Poe lunchbox. There's cookies. There's mulled cider. Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it. Thank you.